carrying the body of the late President Mwai Kibaki and head on to the State House, the Humvees there that will also be accompanying this procession. There's the gun carriage as well that we've seen over the last week, the last few days in the week, as the body was making its way from Knee Funeral to Parliament for the public viewing as he lay in state. And yes, this is definitely taken over by the military, given his role as a commander-in-chief and giving him the final salute. And in terms of the final salute, we'll see a ceremony there at State House that will be given, as well as at the Nyao Stadium for the interdenominational service and prayers for the nation, as thousands have also been invited to join in, and dignitaries will be joining in as well. As we continue with this conversation, Suba has talked about the civil society and the space and the tribute that they have. What would you say, Rose, would be the tribute of the Fourth Estate under President Kibaki, or for the leadership of President Mwai Kibaki?
Well, I think under President Kibaki is when we began to see the potential that media could play in a thriving democracy, where answers are given, where the government understands that it is answerable to a proletariat, to the public, that it exists to serve that public. I mean, we began to get answers and responses. I mean, there's nothing like an inert government. You cover a story and nothing happens. Nobody responds. You know, nothing changes. So, I mean, I think we began to see not a facilitation or enabling, but at least allowing of media to play some role. Mm-hmm. And it played out, I think, when you look at the coverage from that period, it had much less to do with political utterances and a lot more to do with initiatives and development and what was happening at the time. Mm. I remember even when the fallout between the two parties to the government in the second term was happening, I remember a lot of public responses telling the parties, quarrel in private, give us development, because there was that sense that, you know, we like how things are going, just don't make noise, we like how things are going, and just ensure the delivery. Right. We also saw the enactment of media laws. We've been discussing media laws, I think, since 1992, and I think we saw the laws now actually coming into force and into play. You know, even though they were disputes within and under that law, it was the first time we had media law enacted, was under President Kibaki. It was reviewed again in 2013, and I think that's the one that we operate under. Mm-hmm. But the discussion and the movement all happened under President Kibaki's regime.
How different was it for you as a journalist under a Mwai regime and under a Kibaki regime to practice, you know, your art?
I think under the Mwai regime in particular, there was a lot of suspicion in the whole of society. Media, there were not even the divisions. We didn't even compete because life was at stake. We were more collaborators and making sure to look out for each other. And have you heard of so-and-so? You'd go to a press conference and media would gang up because there was special branch planted in the room. Media would gang up and say, okay, please everybody introduce yourself and your newsroom, you know, just to weed out, because we knew they were there. Yeah. So there was a lot of looking out for each other, sharing information across media houses, and it was a matter of life and death. It was survival. Yeah. We had journalists detained for no reason, questioned and tortured by police regularly. We had police and special branch in newsrooms every other day asking about a story. Who did this? Why did they do it this way? You know, that kind of thing. And particularly when I was in the newsroom, we were 2 floors below special branch. So you can imagine they didn't have to go very far. They didn't have to go very far to ask their questions.
Right.
So And I think we always had to question each and every story, even when you have the facts right and you know that the story is accurate. You'd find 5, 6 editors standing around a story thinking, what are the implications? How do we handle this? How do we word this? How do we get it on air?
Yeah.
Not because of the times. Any story could end your career, as it did mine at a TV station.
And I want to get to that incident in a bit. But as you speak of the changing space for media in the Fourth Estate, someone might actually say they recall when there was a certain, actually this building, the First Lady then, Mama Lucy Kibaki, may soul rest in peace, raided this particular newsroom, the paper, the Daily Nation, holding a standard newspaper. Of course, she had her misgivings about a story that we were pursuing. You could take us back to that, and in light of that, such quote-unquote raid wouldn't quite paint the picture of a regime that lets the Fourth Estate thrive, as well as the burning of newspapers at the Standard around the same period.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that, but I think you're talking now about individual incidents of attempted control and muzzling of the media. We had, under Mwai, we were actually talking about disabling your printing presses so you cannot print. You're talking about banning of international publications. We would have The Economist and the Newsweek and whatever stopped at the airport. Nation, I think, had its newsprint withheld. I think Nation from that point started to stock newsprint because at that point I think it was coming in from abroad, and the government just seized it, so you can't print. So it was very overt. It was really, really overt, and it was state-controlled and machinated, So you'd find some of the stories of torture and whatever are quite horrific. If those journalists ever deign to tell those stories, they're actually quite horrific.
Under the previous regime.
Under the Mwai regime.
Mwai regime, yes.
I mean, you have the story of Wallace Gijeri, rest his soul, who we believe was forced out of, he was a photographer, and they say he jumped from a second floor window, but we believe he was pushed out of that window and the rest of his life was a paraplegic, and they refused to compensate him. We had the whispers, and journalists were always in jail. Paul Amina.
Yeah.
I remember Paul Amina, he was with the wire services. And the thing that I remember about Paul Amina is he went in with hair like Churchill's and came out white-haired and has never spoken about what happened. Never spoken, you know? So, I mean, I think there's a whole story that has to be told. So when you talk about Mama Lucy coming to, we think that you had a walk in the park. She didn't do anything. Nobody was hurt. Yeah. Nobody, you continued printing, It
was like a slap on the wrist.
It was like a slap on the wrist, and she didn't really have any real power. She wasn't using state machinery against you, Whereas in the previous regime, they would have switched off your signal. They would have, done all sorts of things.
Right. And as you were speaking there, we could see the son of the former president, Jimmy Kibaki, who just made his way into the precincts of the Lee Funeral Home, accompanied by other family members, we believe even grandchildren, and they're almost making their way to State House as they follow the hearse that will be headed to State House any moment. As we can see, it seems like they're ready to go. And we continue with the conversation. Suba, from the civil society space, as these things were happening about the Fourth Estate, you have the rattling of the snake, you have Mishuki, the man who ruled, with quite some, sternness and firmness. What were you thinking in terms of the media space? Not necessarily to compare with what you've said has happened to those who've gone ahead of us in the media profession. A lot happened under the Mwai regime, but what was going through your mind as you witnessed what was happening then, the raiding of some of the media houses?
Yeah, I think it can be attributed to Kibaki's kind of hands-off. Even as he sought to create space for citizens to freely, express themselves.
Yeah.
I think his laid-back approach to matters of state also created space among those that were close to him to engage in all these, shenanigans that we are talking about. And so in the incident of the First Lady, the late Lucy Kibaki, we are seeing a person who is at a personal level is quite close to the president, and who the security people cannot easily restrain, because if she decides to do something, how do you handle her? Yeah. And I think that is the situation in which the whole incident unfolded, because she's guarded around the clock, but there is also a limit to what her security detail can do and cannot do. Yeah. And so if she decides, as she did, out of rage, yeah, and just do what, sorry to say this, what ladies do best when they feel offended.
Excuse me.
I think that will be challenged. She challenges that.
When they feel offended, no. It was a family thing that spilled over.
Right.
A family thing that spilled over. I do not want to go into the details.
Well, some might say actually it was unnecessary getting into the personal issues,
exactly.
Personal space
yeah.
of the first family.
They felt that there was a bit of encroachment into their space, only to end up also encroaching into the media space, and I think that is what.
And I think.
And as you respond, the hearse there, just leaving the Lee Funeral Home, the slow process, the slow procession that will be headed to State House, the moment we've been waiting for, just to follow through in the final salute, the Kibaki State Funeral, honoring the third president of the Republic of Kenya. There he is, draped in the Kenyan flag, the body of the late President Mwai Kibaki, in the hearse that will be headed to State House for a short ceremony. Our cameraman there making sure we have every shot, and as it goes from down Valley Road to State House Road, then from State House making its way from Procession Way, Kenyatta Avenue, Uhuru Highway and Aerodrome Road. We'll have every shot of that as we follow through with the procession that is heavily guarded, as the former commander-in-chief is escorted by the men and women, I believe, in uniform, who will be escorting and actually literally walking just side by side there as the hearse makes its way to State House. We have all the shots there for you as we continue. Rose, you had something to say in that particular story. Some said it was unnecessary to really just be in the faces of the late President Mwai Kibaki and First Lady Mama Lucy Kibaki, God rest his soul in peace, that reportage wasn't quite necessary. And you also wanted to respond to something Suba said there.
Yes, I mean, I do think that there are ethical issues that were raised by the coverage, and depends on which side you are on. Yeah. Really, what was the value of that story to, the nation, you know? There are lots of families with lots of disputes, and, we don't cover all of them, So, but what I wanted to engage with is the other story where we had the crippling of the, the burning of papers at the Standard, And
it's again, I think there was mercenaries who were involved in the process.
Yeah, but I think in the coverage that we saw come out of it, it seems like, again, you have a rogue group, a rogue cabal of people acting independently. It's not like the whole government machinery. If it had been the whole government machinery, it would not have let up. When you compare it to what would have happened before, it would have shamelessly, ensured that that story was never covered, that the Atur brothers, anybody who touches the story is thrown into a police cell, is thrown into torture cells, is interrogated, and, that kind of thing. So I still attribute it, I still insist that under Kibaki, yes, there were abuses and encroachment on press freedoms, but it was not done as a function of state.
And someone might argue, actually, you couldn't quite point it back to Kibaki having given the order that, raid that media house, teach them a lesson. It was because of his characteristic hands-off, seeming hands-off style. There were people who were pulling the strings. You alluded to that earlier.
Yeah, there were people pulling the strings, and not necessarily on his order. He had the whole machinery of the country. Yeah. He's the commander-in-chief of the country. He still had control over the police, and he didn't use it in the same way that President Mwai used it,
Were there ever phone calls from, we've heard of the stories of the former president, the second president, Daniel Mwai, making phone calls directly to the newsroom. In your experience, any of that direct engagement from Mwai Kibaki?
That I've never heard of. I've never heard of. It doesn't
Maybe
even
from
sound.
His powerful ministers
Exactly.
and what have you.
Yeah, those ones we've heard of. I mean, there are lots of people who insist that an item should go on the news, but I think you get that even today. People who imagine that their power extends further than it does. Mm-hmm. And I think you get that even today, and I think it happens all over the world, where people think that they have more say than other people, over what should happen in the media. But I think we need to distinguish it from the machinery of state being used against you, because when the machinery of state hits you, it's not a small thing. It is not a small thing.
And so you did mention about an experience in your career. Just take us back to that. Under the leadership of Mwai Kibaki, there's a story you did, and it touched on him. What was the situation? And just take us back to that, your experience, Rose.
Yeah, well, it goes actually back to 91, a long time ago in some people's lives. But this is where I say people like Suba were very actively involved in this campaign for reform, and we were covering them all the time and, giving voice to this movement for change. And it was within that, I think President Mwai first demoted President Kibaki, who had served for 10 years. Kibaki served as Minister for Health, still loyally. The reasons were never quite clear. But again, I think there started to be conversations within KANU, which was at that time the only existing party. So we were pushing for repeal of Section 2A to allow multi-party politics. There was a lot of organizing among the political class, among the lawyers, among civil society, and the pressure was really mounting. And there began to be talk within KANU about people wanting to leave, people wanting to cross over, Defect was the word that became very popular and remains popular. So Kibaki's name had come up quite a few times. We had the Matibas and the Rubias who featured quite prominently. They had served within the Kenyatas and the Kenyatta 1 and the Moi regimes. But they were now becoming active voices in the other side, in the opposition side, in the reform side. And Kibaki's name kept coming up. So we had done a couple of stories that these may be some of the people considering.
This is you at which media house?
KTN.
At KTN.
Yeah. And at that time, KTN was the first private television station. There was no other television station.
Other than KBC.
Other than KBC. And so we covered a lot of the opposition and the pro-democracy voices. And on Christmas Day that year, he called the station, and I had not arrived. And journalists will always tell you Christmas is a dead day.
Yeah.
You struggle for news. To arrive at the news station and find Kibaki, Mwai Kibaki has been calling. Oh my goodness,
Yes.
It was like something tremendous. And so eventually I did speak to him and put together a story. He made a one-line statement. Mm-hmm. I have resigned from government and from KANU. That's it. You couldn't get another word out of him. That's what he called to say.
Do with that information as you may.
What you would like to do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, despite 100 questions, but does that mean, does this, what are you trying to say? No, he was not having any of it, you know?
Right.
He stuck to his statement. And so we ran with that story from about mid-morning, about 10 in the morning.
Yeah.
Of course, that's breaking news in that context. And when we put it on for our 1 o'clock bulletin, I was essentially removed 15 minutes later by the chairman, Mr. Jared Kangwana, on a phone call. At that point, they were saying, we will tell you what we're going to do. But 9 days later, yeah.
Give us the context of the ownership then of KTN as well.
The ownership was very mixed. KTN started off as an arm of Kenya Times,
Yeah.
which was a party-owned paper. And I think they quickly realized that investing in television is extremely expensive, extremely expensive. So they then looked for financing, and they brought in Robert Maxwell, the former mogul, huge mogul in English, in global media. So he brought in his people. We had a gentleman called Jeremy Thompson, was his boss on the ground. We had Mike Rolls, and I remember another gentleman from, I think he was from New Zealand or New Zealand. I think he was a New Zealander. And so Maxwell's people were in KTN.
Yeah.
And I think the KANU group weren't quite sure how to behave. So we had a little bit of leeway. I think we had a little bit more leeway because of this arrangement. And then I remember even Mike Rolls, as soon as he heard that I'd been told to go home by the chairman, he calls me and says, oh no, we'll sort it out. But I knew, I live here.
Right.
So my colleagues in the newsroom were telling me, no, don't pack, they're going to call you back. I knew the writing's on the wall. I just took all my things, packed them, and I went home.
Yeah. So you were fired essentially for telling a story that Kibaki has resigned and is leaving the ruling party.
Leaving the ruling party, yeah.
But these were facts undisputed.
They've never been disputed. They've never been disputed. But it speaks to, I mean, when I hesitate to even tell the story, because in today's world it just doesn't even sound like a story.
Right.
You know? I mean, why would you be fired? But the president was so controlling. He liked to be able to fire people before they can say they've left him, you know? So he would keep tabs even on his cabinet ministers and what they're doing, saying how they're behaving, if they look like they're babaiking a little bit, you know. He would fire them on the 1 o'clock news on KBC. Yeah, they would hear an announcement that they've been fired.
Right.
So in essence, I think I inadvertently got in the way of that firing, and coincidentally on that particular Christmas, I think it's the only Christmas since then, all other media houses closed for Christmas. I don't think it has ever happened since, you know?
Shockwaves.
Shockwaves.
Right.
So
but you were vindicated by developments later in terms of the former president, Mwai Kibaki, then leaving the government as a minister and leaving KANU. You were vindicated. Things played out.
I mean, what we carried was never in doubt. I was the news editor. The item was read by the late Wangoi Gashia, who was also a very fiery investigative journalist. And it has never been questioned. And in fact, Mwai Kibaki himself could not believe it. He called, he reached out to me a few days later. He just wanted to understand what exactly happened.
Right.
And I explained the series of events. That's what happened, you know? So that's it.
I think you denied the president to pull a fast one on Kibaki, because I think is what may have offended him is KTN telling the public that the initiative came from Kibaki. I think he would have preferred that, you know, President Mwai has fired.
Yes.
Yes.
So to make him look like he's still in control.
Exactly,
yes.
Exactly. So I think it really cost him the embarrassment he had never suffered, because he was always the one on the offensive.
Yes.
But here he was, you know, there is, you know, somebody who is bold enough, and now the whole world knows. So who has caused this knowledge? It's KTN. So
and so they pay the
end
price.
up paying a price for
And the
what
chairman,
was not necessarily your offense.
And the chairman was his lawyer also, doubled as his lawyer. So,
Exactly.
So.
Interesting history that you've given us in terms of the changing times.
And it has a parallel in what we witnessed the other day, the mock swearing in. I mean,
yes.
Yeah.
But
again,
I mean,
the offense of the media was to tell the world that this is happening.
This is happening.
I mean, there was no doubt. I mean, the state itself knew.
Yes.
And there was a multitude at Uhuru Park, but the media telling the world that this has happened became the offense.
Yeah, and as they make their way down Valley Road to State House, the procession there, I'd want you to also look at whether or not over time we've clawed back on the progress that, because civil society and a free media space thrive. I mean, freedom of expression, basically. It is essential for the Fourth Estate and civil society. If we've clawed back, because you've just brought from the latest experience there of the parallel swearing in of Raila Odinga, and what then happened, the shutting down of, you know, signals going off. And so I believe that was more than just a slap on the wrist.
Yes, it was.
And we had, you know, there was quite an impact. And I mean, the message was sent. Would you say that we've clawed back from, because after Mwai, things developed, things changed, and then now we're having some events that, you know, making you question that the state machinery is really coming down with force?
Exactly, and it's not just events. There is been an attempt to institutionalize them in law. You remember the Security Laws Amendment, you know, bill, and how you know these omnibus bills that have something that impacts on the media or civil society and so on and so forth. Of course, you know, the many incidences of terrorism, acts of terrorism that we have had, you know, have also played a role in this. And the state, particularly under the Jubilee administration, has always thought that the best way to address, you know, these acts of terrorism is to take back with the left hand the constitutional guarantees and fundamental freedoms that the Constitution protects. And so we have had, you know, attempts to even change the law. I mean, we have had so many. You know, thanks to the High Court, I mean, our courts have become very, very explicit on this, particularly in the digital space. We have won so many. We reclaimed so much ground. You remember all these laws that were part of the Security Laws Amendment Bill, and later on, you know, signed into law, and so we have had a deliberate and intentional attempt to claw back. Not just by incidences of, you know, closing TV stations for almost a week without caring how they survive. I mean, these are institutions that have people working for it, and the public depends on it for information. Right. And you just decide, you know, by fiat, you know, that you would not let them operate for more than a week. I mean, that had the potential to kill, literally, you know, the media. And the civil society has had more than its rightful share of those attempts. I mean, we have been called evil society. Remember, we were part of the Wakora network after the Supreme Court nullified the first round of presidential elections in 2017, and many other things. Your own media house here, Walter Menya, has had his share of rebuttals from the NGO Coordination Board when, you know, Mr. Kiprotich Koros, you know, came from nowhere, a temporary employee of the NGO board, who ends up ensnaring Walter Menya and getting arrested when he's just, you know, fresh from hospital. For doing what? A story on Friends of Jubilee Foundation, and how they were able to mobilize resources for President Uhuru's re-election in 2017. And so we have had very, very overt, kind of going back to the Mwai days. That's what we have had under the Jubilee administration. And one of the things we are discussing as civil society is what happens now that the two main horses in the succession matrix will have some elements of Jubilee. So we are saying this one is Jubilee Damu, then this one would be Jubilee Plasma. So how will this play out? Because whichever government, whichever side wins after August 9th, we'll have some elements of Jubilee. So will the pro-reform forces be able to, stamp the authority and nip in the bud some of these, bad habits that we have gone through in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and besides the clawing back, you have mentioned earlier about in the reform journey, stagnation of sorts from the Kibaki administration that was really facilitating.
Exactly. I mean, we have had a law. I mean, it is unprecedented. I don't think there is any jurisdiction in the world that has as a law that has been assented to by the president, and then it's kept frozen for 10 years.
Right.
And people feel nothing about it. I mean, we have a constitution that in Article 10 talks about accountability.
Yeah.
And to date, the executive, feels, continues completely unaccountable. Not even to the directives of the court, completely unbothered. The other day, I saw the Ministry of Interior, the Cabinet Secretary, threatening that NGOs that have not, filed returns would be re-registered, and they are in their thousands.
Yeah.
What he conveniently forgot is that in a similar function, on the 28th of January, 2019, he promised to enact the new law. I mean, why not just do the new law? Because it will come with a lot of incentives.
Yes.
A lot of those groups that they want to file returns have since migrated to other regulatory frameworks. They have registered as trusts, they have registered as not-for-profit companies. The NGO Coordination Board just became thuggish and molesting everybody in town. And when they were busy deregistering groups that they felt were allied to the opposition in the run-up to 2017 elections, you remember the Kalonzo Musyoka Foundation was one of those that were deregistered. Evans Kidero Foundation. There was even an organization linked to one of Raila's daughters. And the whole idea was to, close any avenue through which the opposition competitors could perhaps access funding from outside and so on and so forth.
Right.
While that was happening, we had, new groups being registered. Jaguar Foundation. You must have seen trolleys, a lot of trolleys in this city,
yes,
given by Jaguar Foundation. But the most dramatic of them was the Sonko Rescue Team. Fazul Mohammed, writes to Sonko and says, we have seen you are doing charitable work, yet your organization is not registered with us. Then Sonko, succumbs and registers with them. Within 3 months of registration of Sonko Rescue Team, Fazul presides over a ceremony where it is declared to be the best performing NGO. and that's happening while others, perceived to be allied to opposition, are being deregistered. So we have gone through a lot of hell, right, and clawback. And we want to believe that, now that the Jubilee administration has refused to implement the law, the Public Benefit Organizations Act, we want to believe that, and we'll be soon asking them to provide it in their manifestos, that they will implement the Public Benefit Organizations Act as soon as they get into power.
Right.
Yeah.
And as you can see here, just they're getting to State House, where there'll be a short ceremony and then head on to Nyayo Stadium. That is a procession with the hearse carrying the body of the late President Mwai Kibaki. And as soon as they leave there, they'll be leaving with the President Uhuru to Nyayo Stadium. He'll be right behind this procession, behind the hearse, with the escort there from the military. Rose, you were jotting down some points, and what we have been talking about, in case you just joining us, you've been hearing the voice of Suba and Rose talking about the spaces that have changed. Different sector players have spoken of how things were for them under the Kibaki regime, the economic sector. I mean, just this past week, someone told me, I am who I am because of Kibaki. My business, I've never done that well compared to that period when Kibaki was president. Many in their 20s now crediting their education, saying they went through free primary education thanks to his regime. So many players speaking about how things changed for them, and even Mwananchi talking about their personal experience under the leadership of Mwai Kibaki. And we've just spoken about media and how things had changed from the second president's regime, that is Daniel Arap Moi, which had a lot of oppression in terms of the Fourth Estate and the space that the Fourth Estate had to operate, going into the Mwai Kibaki regime, where there was a bit more room to practice freedom of expression. But then now getting into the current Jubilee administration, things have in many ways clawed back. And that is what Suba and Rose have been talking about. And you were jotting down something, especially when he was talking about whether or not the current administration has seen retrogression or going back to what we had built from the Daniel Arap Moi regime and what we had actually developed in the Mwai Kibaki regime, the space for media, for civil society to operate.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Suba. We've watched it in many ways and on so many angles. I mean, initially I think there was an attempt to use a big hammer on people and, you know, the use of force in the initial stages. Mm-hmm. But I think they quickly realized that wouldn't work in today's Kenya. There's too much civic awareness mm-hmm. of people's rights. And so now we see much more covert use of power to undermine the functioning of these institutions.